Welcome to Permitted with Conditions, a podcast about zoning, land use, housing, and economic development. I'm David Toyer, the host of Permitted with Conditions and also the president of Toyer Strategic Advisors, a land use and economic development consulting firm. I've got with me today State Representative Jessica Bateman, who's a former Olympia City Councilwoman, currently a state representative for the 22nd District, which includes Olympia, Tumwater, and Lacey. She is also the sponsor of some very significant, groundbreaking, no pun intended, housing legislation over the last few sessions, including HB 1110, which is known as the Missing Middle Housing Bill, and HB 1337, which is the Accessory Dwelling Units Bill. Welcome to the podcast, Representative. Thank you for your time.
Hi, David. Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Get things started. You, before jumping into the legislature, served on the Olympia City Council. What got you into elected service? What was your main driver for deciding to step up and take on those responsibilities?
Well, I was a legislative assistant at the time and also an Olympia planning commissioner. I had served on the planning commission for about 2 years when I decided to run for city council. And what ultimately pushed me towards running, and I was reluctant to do that because I worked for a state lawmaker and I knew what that entailed. I wasn't the most excited person about going out and do all the public speaking and all that engagement. I wanted to work for an elected official. But when I was on the Olympia Planning Commission, there was a city council race where someone that decided they were going to run was very anti-housing. And I saw our city, which is a little gem in Thurston County, really primed for new housing, kind of a renaissance in the downtown, and just having it be a more livable, walkable city for everyone to enjoy. And having been serving on the Planning Commission, I knew the policies and kind of the roadmap for how to make that happen. And I didn't want to see the city kind of become stagnant and not move forward. And so I decided to do that, to run for city council. And I got really involved in land use because when I ran in 2015, the number one issue when I talked with voters was homelessness and our growing unhoused population. And I didn't know anything really about homelessness. And so I started delving into that, talking with providers of services for our unhoused neighbors. And that led me to sponsoring and managing the Home Fund Initiative, which was a local initiative to create municipally funded permanent supportive housing for chronically unhoused neighbors. And after we passed that, I was really interested in figuring out what's the real root problem that we need to be addressing. Why are we experiencing so many people falling into homelessness? Why are we experiencing these exponential increases in home prices? And when I did that, I realized that cities in the midst of a housing shortage and crisis continue to have really regressive, restrictive zoning policies that don't enable diverse housing options to respond to the market and our new adaptation to the land use that we need to be doing now, which is smaller, more nimble, more flexible housing that's quicker and faster and more cost effective. And so that really kind of led me on the path of working on middle housing legislation, which I worked on when I was on the Olympia City Council, and then when I came to the legislature.
Yeah, I appreciate that background of Planning Commission and City Council. I know we had previously Joe Tovar, it's kind of one of the grandfathers of growth management, on for a couple of episodes talking about the Growth Management Act and how it came about and changes over the last few years, including some that came out of the Roadmap to Washington's Future. And I know one of the points he emphasized in one of the episodes was just how the construct of the legislature has changed, where there are more representatives that have a local background in trying to administer growth management, but also trying to deal with some of the challenges like housing. And they have some level of experience that really give them a great policy background for that. You touched on a couple of those items. Is there, a couple of specific, projects or code amendments or things that you might point to from your experience on the Planning Commission or City Council that really helped kind of shape how you wanted to focus on housing once you got to the legislature?
Yeah. And first, I'll respond to your former comment about there being more elected officials in the legislature that have prior local government experience. I think we've seen that for a while, and that can actually work both ways because the culture traditionally in the legislature has been to acquiesce to what cities ask for and to really honor the requests of cities. And forever, cities have said, we will maintain local control forever. Like, we want that. It's a priority for us. I mean, even up until a year or two ago, the AWC, the Association for Washington Cities, it was one of their tenet, principles, what they would defend and fight for local control. I think what's changed is our housing shortage and crisis have continued to get worse. People in our communities, our constituents, voters are acutely aware that it is not just impacting our lowest income, chronically unhoused neighbors, it's impacting families, it's impacting people that are working jobs that should have and traditionally have been jobs where you could buy a home or have a home that you rent and are not spending 50% of your income on your housing costs. So that's changed, but also we have more elected officials in the legislature that are younger and more diverse and more connected to the issue of being cost burdened with housing and the direct ramifications of how that impacts your life and your family's lives. And so the combination of those things, I think, have made the real difference. Obviously, having a background in local government and planning enables you to navigate a very technical bill on housing, which is like healthcare. It's very complex and very nuanced, and that helps people be more effective, thankfully. A policy that really got me involved in this issue and propelled me into working on it in the legislature was working on middle housing legislation. When I was on the Olympia City Council, we made it a priority to make our zoning more flexible to allow for duplexes and fourplexes in the city. And that process that we went through to make those code changes was so time intensive and staff intensive. It took us 3 years, 44 public meetings, 1,200 pages of written comment, 3 public hearings. And even at the end of all of that, when we voted in support of these changes, people criticized us and said, you didn't do enough public engagement. It wasn't enough. And a group of wealthy community members hired one of the best land use attorneys that worked on the Growth Management Act in the state, and were successful in taking that to the Growth Management Hearings Board and overturning it. So it was effective for 6 months. And then after that, we were not able to have any more people that wanted to build those types of homes. Subsequently, after that, the legislature passed House Bill 1928, which gave cities the ability to implement middle housing without SEPA being used against them. And there was a menu of housing options they had to choose. After House Bill 1928 passed, we were able to pass a second middle housing ordinance, actually on my very last day of my term on Olympia City Council, because I resigned my position once I was elected to the legislature. So on my very last city council meeting, we passed it for the second time, which did stand. So when I got to the legislature, I thought to myself, we're in a climate crisis. Literally, the planet's on fire. We're in a housing shortage, which is causing a housing crisis. Do we really want 260 cities to tackle this issue independently, taking up to 3 years each time and going through this laborious process when, it's just so simple. If you are in a housing shortage and you're not building enough homes to keep up with population growth, why on earth would you make it more restrictive, more expensive, and more time consuming to build housing? That's the opposite of what we should be doing. The essence of a crisis requires that we do things differently, that we triage, that we assess what we need to do, what we need to change. We have to be open to changing things in the way that we've done them forever. Since the Growth Management Act was implemented in the early 90s, I would say we've had a challenge with creating enough housing for our population growth. And that backlog of housing that we haven't been able to build for so long, we're still dealing with that deficit. And then each year we continue to grow further and further and behind, about 10,000 homes. And right now, because of interest rates, we're growing further behind, which is also the exact opposite of what we should be doing. So that's really what motivated me to work on this issue at the state level. And Representative Macri had worked on this bill before. It had never made it out of the Housing Committee in the House. And so I introduced middle housing in 2022, and it died fantastically. It was the first year I introduced it. And then I brought it back again in 2023, did a lot of outreach and organizing partnerships, bipartisan work. Representative Barkas was my #2 sponsor on the bill. So all of that, lent itself to making that bill pass in 2023. We also passed, more housing bills in that year than we had in the previous 10. It was a significant year for housing, which was great. But, I'm telling people going into 2025, the issue of building enough housing commensurate with population growth has not been solved. We have done the low-hanging fruit, just the most obvious things, making it legal to build accessory dwelling units or ADUs, making it legal to build permanent supportive housing, making it legal to build co-living spaces or as single room occupancy. That is literally the definition of low-hanging fruit, making it legal to do so. Now we have to be looking at what are the additional barriers to getting these homes on the market and built and sustainable, because developers haven't been building them for so long, because they have been outlawed. They're not used to doing it. This is not a portfolio, something that the template that they have. So we're going to have to continue that work and figure out, how do we get these homes actually built so we can, and not only that, but look at systemic barriers and regulations and things that we are involved with as government that contribute to this problem.
And I think for me, on that regard, with the changes in legislation and the housing types allowed now and just the focus on infill development, you're still going to see certain large developments, whether they be multifamily or single family, but you're going to see a lot more smaller stuff. And there's been a number of articles that others have written about it as of late, but we don't have the same like builders class of folks out there that do these types of projects anymore. I mean, we used to back in the early 2000s. The recession came in 08, 09, wiped a lot of that out. A lot of those companies and entities, their lot supply, what they had left was bought up by larger, national developers. And so, I think that there's some work that's probably going to have to be done in many cases just to get, builders and developers that focus on that type of product to jump into the marketplace and start building at a scale that does have an impact.
Yeah, I agree.
Talking about the missing middle housing and HB 1110, I know that you're really focused on following that up, but I think kind of looking at that and kind of how cities are managing that process right now, because that's where we're at. You've enacted it, cities are implementing it. And there's a number of cities and counties that are doing that right now under their comprehensive plan updates. Seattle being one of those. And I know you've spoken out in a couple of instances. How frustrating is it potentially as a legislator to work on some of these new policies and really hope for some kind of grand change? And then, to see situations like with Seattle's, I mean, I think wholesale around, most people agree that they really didn't push as hard as they could have pushed to try to deal with the challenges being the largest city in the state and the need to create housing, especially around transit. What are your thoughts on that as far as kind of, in the after effects, like that wasn't really what we were expecting?
I would say that I anticipated that cities would employ creative and innovative ways to circumvent the legislation, to not have to apply the legislation as it was intended. The culture of cities since the Growth Management Act passed was that we delegate all local zoning authority to them. And I knew that was a big change for cities in Washington state. The reason why it was so necessary for us to address a statewide zoning floor is because we have failed at the local level to adapt and to create enough housing, allow for the construction of enough housing for our population growth, which I think is incredibly irresponsible and also, not abiding to the principles with the Growth Management Act. I mean, the Growth Management Act has always stated that we have to concentrate growth in cities. That's where our infrastructure is. We want to preserve our open spaces, our forests, our farmlands. It's the whole reason why we have concentrated growth in cities. Cities are where people are. It's where homes need to be built. It's where businesses need to be built, amenities, all of those things. And you have to have homes for people to live in order to have bustling, vibrant, thriving cities. So it's a core responsibility of local governments is to have a good, solid plan for how you're going to accommodate population growth. And for decades, cities have not done that well. They have been opposed to new construction of homes. They've, the entire system of public engagement around how do we gauge the level of support within our community for the construction of new homes is built around the people that already have homes in the first place. So it's not an equitable or fair process, in my opinion. And the reason why we had to tackle it at the state issue is because we have a vested interest in making sure that Washington has enough homes for its population growth. That's how we're going to have a thriving economy, thriving cities, and all those things. So I'm not surprised at all that cities like Seattle, which is the largest city in the state of Washington, is slow walking its comprehensive plan housing element and its projections for housing. I'm disappointed that the largest city in the state, the economic hub of our region, isn't taking a leadership role, isn't being innovative, isn't thinking broadly about not only their responsibility to have enough housing for future populations, but also the impact that that will have on other cities who are looking to Seattle, especially neighboring cities, and thinking to themselves, well, Seattle's just going like baseline on this, so we don't have to go aim high either. It's a really big missed opportunity for Seattle to demonstrate its leadership on this issue, but ultimately it's irresponsible, in my opinion. And that's why we have to address these issues at the state level, because of these prime examples that we have again and again of cities that are, really derelict in their duty to have thriving cities for people and places for people to live. You want to have economic development. You want to have people that have jobs there that support taxes and revenue for your city. How are you going to have that if you don't have places for people to live and if people are struggling because they're spending half of their income on their housing costs? We have to be thinking about all of those things together. And on the issue of housing, the state has to take a more active role. That's why I think oversight is important, because we are seeing these behaviors. I had a bill last year, the Housing Accountability Act, which would have provided oversight by the Department of Commerce of cities' comprehensive plan housing elements that they would have to submit to the Department of Commerce for review. Not only would Commerce be reviewing their housing element and their proposed ordinance changes to comply with these new set of laws, ADUs, middle housing, co-living spaces, and permanent supportive housing, but Commerce would also be looking at the development regulations to see and ensure that the housing construction is feasible. So it's not just the ordinance that says, by law, we allow for the construction of middle housing. It's also the minimum lot size, the setback requirements, the height restrictions. If you say that it's legal in your ordinance, but you technically make it all but infeasible to construct based on market conditions, based on demand, based on all these things, then you're not actually making it, legal. You're impeding the ability. And in House Bill 1220 from a couple years back, that required cities to allow the construction of permanent supportive housing. And also in their housing elements, they have to come up with the new set of planning for the growth for cities, for housing, but also different segments of the population economically, which for the first time ever, cities will have to think about, how are we going to have enough housing for 0 to 50% AMI, 50 to 100, et cetera. In that legislation, it also says you have to make it feasible to construct these homes. That is the technical language that's in the law. So if they're having development regulations that make it infeasible, that is a violation, in my opinion. So the Housing Accountability Act wouldn't just provide oversight, it would actually provide ramifications, grants that cities are ineligible for if they are out of compliance. Also publicly listing the cities that are out of compliance, so individuals can actually go through the growth management hearings board process if they choose to. I don't love that process because it puts the onus on individuals to hire an attorney and go through a very technocratic, process. I do think that we need to be, as government, providing a more proactive role in ensuring we achieve the outcomes that we want, and we've made all of these laws legal. It's the responsibility of cities to adhere to them. The last element of that bill would be that it would provide the builder's remedy, which is modeled after California and simply says, if you're out of compliance with your housing element and the laws for legalizing housing, if a builder comes in with a permit for a housing project, irregardless of the underlying zoning, you have to approve it if 20% of the units are affordable at 60 to 80% AMI. And I think that's a real direct link between providing ramifications and also a solution to actually creating the housing that we so desperately need, and hopefully will be a deterrent for cities to create their own policies in their own communities. It's not about like, we need housing, we have to have housing. So the city's role is having housing that, is reflective of their community's values, and they can go through that process, but they have to make it legal and feasible to do that.
Yeah, I think that's going to be interesting to see how things work without that in place. I think, like what you talked about relative to Seattle and just other jurisdictions, I still see out there, I mean, we follow a number of communities, that there is a lot of looking at all of this as it's always a ceiling, right? It's like, oh, the growth target's a ceiling. We're planning to this target. It's never looked at as like, that's a floor. Like, what's
right.
there's not a flaw or there's not something wrong with maybe planning for more than what you're required to take. Like, is there an inherent problem with taking a population forecast that is 1,000 people over what your assigned target supposedly is? And I want to just maybe touch on that issue with you kind of next. There was an article in the Urbanist last week, and you were quoted in that talking about wanting to spend some time working with subject matter experts on growth targets and how they're formulated and what the options are to encourage jurisdictions to aim higher. That's been a big topic for me, actually, as an individual and also in the work that I do. And my concern has always been that jurisdictions, for the most part, when they're sitting down to do their planning processes, they get three numbers from the state department or state office of financial management. They get a low number, a mid number, and a high number. And almost, as a matter of course, they pretty much select the mid number and aim for that. And that to me has always been a little bit of a frustration, because what happens if we grow faster, even if it's just for a short period of time, than what the mid-range target is, and we haven't effectively planned for the infrastructure or the housing or anything else that has to go along with that. And I have still never been able to get an answer from demographers at like the county level that are often putting these population targets and land analysis together of that. That's great. You're planning for the future projected number that we're gonna get in 20 years, but we've got this housing deficit now. How does the housing deficit balance reconcile against the balance of kind of housing we are forecasting? There doesn't seem to be great correlation there. And I know, I was actually shocked. Clark County, when they did their population targets, chose a higher number than the midpoint, pretty substantially higher number. And they did it with a bit of criticism because they were being pushed in that direction by the local building and real estate industries saying, hey, plan for a little bit more. If we're successful with economic development, that's a good thing, but it's also going to mean we need more housing. It's been a few days since that article came out, and I've kind of thrown a little bit at you here. But is there opportunities you think in the future for the legislature as you look at this issue more to kind of dive into the housing targets, the population forecasting, and even in my mind, I still think there's some inherent flaws in the buildable lands methodologies, despite the legislature adopting a bill a couple of years ago that was helpful in getting communities to re-examine their methodologies. But at least from my experience, we didn't see a lot of actual change in what they were predicting.
Yeah, I think, when I think about the growth targets, I think we've had this system in place for so long, and it's continued to get us results that are not aligned with our goals and are actually antithetical to the goals that we have. So if what we've been doing isn't working, why would we continue doing it? It deserves to be analyzed and looked at to determine, why is this process that we've deemed to be the model, why is it not enabling us to achieve our goals? I think that one of the things that cities would say is, and the state would even say, because of the Growth Management Act, is if you aim for higher with your population targets, then you're responsible for the commensurate capital facilities that you'll need in order to have that population. And I think, cities continue to struggle with funding. I mean, they're constrained with what they can raise in terms of revenue to pay for services. And they are, as a former local government elected official, I'd be remiss if I didn't say that they are very much struggling with providing the services that people expect, want, and need with the budgets that they have. So I am sensitive when they ask for revenue or they say that they don't have revenue for things. I think that it's a part of a healthy system when you're aiming for a higher number than you potentially think that you need, especially when we see the history of that. Yeah, the majority of cities do that mid-range number. And then, collectively, we're not building enough housing to keep up with population growth. I also think that just having the zoning that allows for the construction for that number doesn't mean that you will actually get that housing built, because builders are going, they're smart. They're looking at the economic conditions. They're looking at how, what's the customer base? Am I going to be able to sell this? Is this a place where people want to live? I mean, the housing situation is so bad right now. I mean, housing is pretty much plentiful anywhere. If you actually build it, you're going to have people that will buy it. But in a market, there's so many things. If we didn't have this long running deficit, you have things where they attract people. They want to live in certain areas. We know that young people, by and large, want to live in cities. They do not want to have to commute an hour to and from work like they have seen their parents, like I saw my parent. So we, especially, the most horrible example of this is the big cities like Seattle, where we know that's where people want to be. That's where we have so much investment in our infrastructure and we have so many amenities there. It makes no sense to me that you wouldn't aim to the highest level possible. We also know that you need, in order to have a vacancy rate that's healthy for prices to stabilize and not have these extreme swings and exponential increases, you have to have a certain vacancy rate. And right now it's so unhealthy. We're seeing it's very, very difficult to have that competitiveness. It's not there. So I think that we need to figure out, how do we change this to kind of move the dials a little bit to achieve the goals that we want. I also think that so much of our infrastructure is more energy efficient and more cost effective now. So like I live in a home, it's a single family home, 2 bedroom, 1 bathroom. And one of the changes that we made when I was on city council was to say, if you build an ADU on your property, you don't have to add a new sewer line unless if you can demonstrate that the current sewer line has the capacity for that added unit. The family size now is a lot smaller than it was when my home was built, which was 1953. And so the capacity is completely fine if there's only 3 people living on that property, right, for the infrastructure. So we need to be thinking about, how do we have infrastructure that is going to be sustainable and is actually going to be, address the needs of our communities. And that might look different. We need to be thinking about that too. But just using infrastructure as a reason to not aim higher is insufficient, in my opinion, especially when you look at the overall benefit of having people living in cities, adhering to the Growth Management Act, and also having a system where we have abundant housing for everybody. That far outweighs the constraints of infrastructure, in my opinion.
Yeah, and without me getting into the weeds too much, maybe 3 points I'd like to touch on relative to those thoughts is, one, if you don't plan for that additional target or additional population or growth, I think you got a problem with your capital facilities plans, especially school districts, and whether it's a city or a county or a park district, parks, because, acquisition costs associated with just acquiring the property to have those capital facilities are so high that if you're not planning for it well in advance and making efforts, if you can land bank, in my mind, you're so far behind. I mean, where I live right now, it's a struggle. I don't foresee how it is that this local school district is going to be able to come up with the property to be able to provide the format of schools that they're going to need in the future. There's a disconnect there because all of the available land's been developed over the last few years, and it's been developed faster than anticipated in that community. And a lot of that was because it was a spillover effect. There was communities around it that were less growth friendly. They were, growth friendly in doing their job. And so they built out super fast. And so I think that growth planning aspect of making sure that you're planning for the capital facilities you could need in the future is important, even though it does come with that potential cost impact side of things. The other thing that I think is important, you brought it up, is the efficiency of infrastructure. And I think too, it's the alternative infrastructure that may be available that should also be on the table. And we routinely, I'd say 1 or 2 projects a year have folks that come to us where they're struggling in jurisdictions to get a city to accept something other than traditional sewer service. So there's, systems out there called grinder pumps. They're kind of an individual pump system that gets your sewer out from where you're at. They're used in areas where there's challenged topography or, special wetlands and those sorts of things. But they're an alternative, but they're not kind of the traditional way of doing it. And jurisdictions tend to not like that and don't want to accept it. We've done some research on it. Olympia, your city that you were on the council of, is probably one of the most flexible jurisdictions when it comes to using grinder pumps. But it's just even small little things like that, and that's getting into the weeds, that just make it challenging where you've got development opportunities and you can't move forward the development economically if you're doing it with traditional sewer, but there may be options to being able to effectively do it or effectively utilize the land by doing it that way, as opposed to what might otherwise be expected. And at this point, we've used the great land, right? The good,
Yes.
flat, nice, pristine dirt is gone, and we are on the sides of hills and dealing with all kinds of challenges to being able to move water and sewer and get infrastructure service to locations.
Yeah. And, when you look at the demand for housing over the next 20 years, I mean, that's a daunting figure. 1 million homes, 500,000 need to be affordable at 0 to 50% AMI. We don't have any example of that type of efficiency in the construction of housing. And the state does not have any examples of it being able to build that or fund the construction of affordable housing to that level. The Housing Trust Fund has built 65,000 homes since it was created in 1986, so almost 40 years of data, and it's a sliver of what we're going to need over the next 20 years. So we have to be looking at new ways to adapt to our current situation, which is that we're in a housing shortage and crisis. We don't have land that's just becoming available to us, as you mentioned. If it's good land and it's viable, it's been built. And the homes that we're constructing today are designed to last for decades. So we need to be making these laws flexible now so we can have that land, the housing constructed in the future. And, that all requires us to be aiming higher on those growth targets.
Yeah, it's to me it's a real superior challenge, and I still think it starts at the level of planning where you're picking a target and you're identifying what lands you think are available and buildable, and you're applying market reduction factors to say there's only so much of this people are willing to sell over a given period of time. So what's our backup plan? If we expect 75% of it to be available for sale at any given time, but it's really 50%, 25% of a land supply that may not be available when the market's at its peak. I mean, that's in my mind where we're losing the calibration between, and we're out of equilibrium between the housing production that's being, completed versus, the need that's arrived at our doorstep, in essence.
Right.
The legislature, I mean, you talked about this earlier. What was it, 10 bills, I think, that were passed the session before last that were focused on housing. You got a couple of more things done this last legislative session. I think it's a question that a lot of, folks have probably asked. But do you see the legislature, and I infer from some of your other answers, yes, the answer is yes, but do you see the legislature continuing to focus on housing as an issue? And is it more focused on zoning and housing, or if the answer is yes, like, is the focus going to start shifting towards some of these things with the kind of early planning and early work that's done, that's the foundation by which then zoning and everything else is built?
I mean, yes, we have to continue working on housing. And one of the challenges within the legislature is if you have a big year where you work on a specific policy area significantly, there's this tendency to think, okay, well, we've worked on that, and now next year we're going to move on to the next thing. And there's a reason why we do that, and there's that tendency is because we have so many issues that come before us, and it's just a natural process to be like, okay, we addressed that, now let's move on to all of these other competing really important priorities. I would say that what we've done so far is the low-hanging fruit. We have to continue our concerted, focused, determined effort to ensure that we are creating a system where we're allowing for just the naturally occurring creation of enough housing for our population growth. That has to be the norm. It has to be expected and what we're accomplishing every year. And we are far from creating a system where that is achievable, possible, or that we have evidence that actually is occurring. I say that we need a Marshall Plan for housing. It's going to require years worth of work to reverse this change or reverse this trend of us not being able to build housing for population growth. I do think a part of this discussion will be things that we've talked about, the planning process for the growth targets and buildable lands. I also think it's going to be talking with builders and developers and the financiers and the workforce to figure out what are these tangible barriers that really get in the way of you being able to deliver on housing as timely and effectively as possible. I think that there's still significant areas that we could work on there. I'm starting the process of working with my colleagues on building a coalition and identifying what those barriers are in preparation for 2025 so that we can again have a bipartisan platform and portfolio of bills that we agree on both sides of the aisle that are supply side focused. I think that we have a lot of work to do there. And I think that it should be a annual housekeeping, even if we were to have, solved the housing crisis and created this system where the norm is that we're building enough housing for population growth, we would still need to be every year kind of doing a housing inventory of like, okay, how are we doing? What's the dashboard say? How many permits did we actually do last year? How much housing are we creating? What are the additional barriers? And do we like what we're seeing? Do we have to adjust and change? Because so many things will change and do change just because it's a market, right? We're going to see a lot more demand for housing in the coming years, I think, for other things like climate refugees and people that are moving here from other areas. So we're going to have to continue to be vigilant about looking at how are we actually doing on all of these other numerics for how we're creating the housing we need to actually build.
Yeah. And, I just look at still there's a lot of individual restrictions out there that, in my mind, influence the pace at which housing can be created. And I'll give a for instance. You still have jurisdictions located out there that require annexation to the city prior to development being able to occur because they control water and sewer service. And so they adopt in their water and sewer codes, we're not going to provide you service unless you annex to the city first. And in those cases, annexation processes can at a minimum take 9 months, provided there's no hitch and creating the boundaries of the annexation, and you may have to bring some people along. Do you have folks that are adjacent neighbors that are willing to be annexed and knowing that it's going to lead to their property adjacent to them being developed? To me, that's still kind of problematic. And there's a lot of jurisdictions out there that, growth management kind of envisions cities as the ultimate provider of urban services. The county shouldn't be in the business. Well, if that's the case, as a city, shouldn't cities maybe be required in the next few years to step up and have an annexation plan that they have to implement to come up with, expand out to your boundaries, take control of this, be responsible. And right now, it seems to me it falls oftentimes on the developer or the landowner to take care of those responsibilities. So that's another instance, at least what we see on the ground, as kind of one of those impacts. And that's not really a zoning question, and that's not really a planning and population targets question. But procedurally, it has a dramatic impact on the timing of being able to get something done.
Yeah, I remember that from my time on city council. So that would be an example of something that is worth looking at. The real challenge is, as a lawmaker, what I have to do is I have to make that list, and then we have to determine what's the biggest bang for our buck. Where are we going to focus our limited capital, political capital, and time and energy this year? And that's, based on a lot of factors. One is, do people understand it? Can we move it? Is there, how much support can we get from diverse stakeholders on this? How many homes would this actually be a barrier to creating? Or what's our return on our investment? Or how easy, if it's something that is relatively small but would be very easy to do, then, sometimes that happens too. And maybe we have 10 really easy bills and we just do all those things. Or maybe we have 2 really, really big, hard ones. So that's the process that we're in right now. I think it's going to take more work. And even though middle housing took a lot of work, and I mean, I worked on that issue for 8 years, including my time on city council. But now we really have to, it's a different type of policy work, because now we're having to identify things that are not low hanging fruit, which means the people that are on the ground doing the work, they have these answers. I don't have these answers because I don't build housing. I need to talk with the people that actually do the work and are navigating these processes. Like, when design review in Seattle, I mean, that shouldn't take 3 years to go through that process to create housing when we're in a housing shortage on what is currently a parking lot. That's just unacceptable. So I was really happy to see us change the design review from objective to subjective, and hopefully we'll see some changes with that.
Yeah, and somebody that works with folks all the time and sees the effect of some of these policies. I mean, that to me is a big one. We've, over the years, whether it be a residential or other type of project, some of the design review processes and jurisdictions, I don't even know how to describe them.
Archaic.
Like we've had what jurisdictions request, like, well, if you just, put murals of the local sports teams on the side of the building, like that would break up the facade. And it's like, that doesn't play out well over the long term as far as looking good and everything else. So we, at least folks like myself, we appreciate the fact that the legislature created some uniform standards by which it said, okay, from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, there's an expectation of how this process should go. And to me, whether it be middle housing or design standards or AD, or even the work the legislature's done on tiny homes on wheels over the last few years, all of those types of things, creating some standardization from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, in my mind, helps out as well, just because it's like, you go to a new jurisdiction, you're not necessarily having to recalibrate everything that you do in your building model to be able to be in that next jurisdiction. And so, building at a scale or companies being able to have multiple projects they're spreading risk over is an important aspect of things. So thank you for all the work that you've done on those various topics and really focusing on housing over the last several legislative sessions. I appreciate it. I know there's a lot of other folks out there that do, and there's a ton of folks that don't understand the significance of what's happening, but hopefully they do as things start to get implemented and we see change in housing actually being created.
Yeah, I think one of the things that helps this issue hopefully continue to be in the spotlight and have work done on it is how intersectional housing is. I mean, it impacts so many areas of a person's life, and it's a foundational issue that everyone needs. Everyone needs a home. Everyone has to live somewhere. And where you live impacts so many different facets and elements of your life, and how much you're spending on your housing, your opportunity to build roots in a community, to, start your own home, build equity, have stability. I mean, it's just, the list goes on and on and on. There's health impacts to it, wealth, intergenerational wealth building. And it's impacting so many Washingtonians. We're seeing in every single county in this state, it's one of the #1 issues that voters talk about to their elected officials. So I hope that next year we're going to continue the progress that we made in 2023. 2024 was a short session. We kind of thought about the housing policies that year as, what did we not finish in 2023? And what do we need to continue to do from our menu of 2023? And that's where you saw the focus on tenant protections, transit-oriented development, lot splitting. And unfortunately, none of those bills passed. So those are still on the menu for next year. But I'm looking forward to building a coalition again and making sure that we have bipartisan support so we can just come through the gate and have a list of issues that we know we can work on.
Yeah, it'll be exciting to see how this progresses over the next few years, both in the results of what's been passed as well as, what else could be done to address the topic.
Yeah. And the last thing I'll say is, and I know we're getting close to time, is, the Housing Accountability Act did not pass last year. And I think that the example that we will see set by the 2024 cities that are going through that process now is going to be a great example of why we need the Housing Accountability Act to pass, to ensure that all of the laws that the legislature voted into law are actually adhered to at the local level. And so when we see the results of how it plays out in the rest of this year, it's going to be a really good opportunity to say, this is needed and we need to make sure that we take action on this.
Yeah, I just thought it was pretty unprecedented too, just the actual bills themselves when they passed, having provisos in them that, if a jurisdiction doesn't address the required updates on middle housing and accessory dwelling units, that they had, until 6 months after their plan adoption, or state law, supersedes, that's a pretty different, direction that the legislature went on pathwise to say, hey, this is how serious we are. This is how serious this issue is. If you're not going to make sure you address it, then we're just going to make sure that what we've set as the standard is the standard. So,
yep. I agree.
Well, I really appreciate your time today. Thank you for all your work on housing policies and reforms. And I want to thank the folks that are listening to this podcast episode for tuning in to another edition of Permitted with Conditions. Please don't forget to subscribe to continue to get updates when new episodes drop. Typically, they drop on Fridays. They're also available on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. And you can follow Torres Strategic Advisors on LinkedIn, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, all of the fun social media platforms. So thank you again, Representative Bateman, for your time today and all the work that you've done.
Thank you. My pleasure. Have a great day.
Thanks, you too.
Okay, take care.